participants. In the following session, we will have our first lecture on the human condition by Siri Hustvedt, and I would like to express a very warm welcome to her. Siri, it is a great honor that you will contribute with a series of lectures to the Youth Symposium. Lectures on the human condition mean to reconsider once again what is it like to be human. These lectures to the Youth Symposium mean giving them in such a way that young people and communities dealing with education can focus on the embodied human being in the world with others. I would like to thank Siri for her commitment to the symposium and to how she decided to present the human condition in a new and vivid way. She will be giving us 3 lectures. Because of the wide range of her work, she has written wonderful essays, fascinating novels, and scientific papers. I have decided to introduce her step by step. Today, I will start with her essays. In her collection of essays, Living, Thinking, Looking, in German, Leben, Denken, Schauen, one essay title is Embodied Visions, What Does It Mean to Look at a Work of Art? In German, Mit dem Körper sehen, was bedeutet es, ein Kunstwerk zu betrachten? Another collection of essays has the title, A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women. If Picasso, as a man, paints a woman looking at him, what is going on there? And what about me, looking at this woman painted by Picasso, looking at me? If Siri is venturing into these fields, the human condition becomes very, very exciting, and the daily experience will turn into deep philosophical thoughts. Siri, I'm really looking forward to hearing your first lecture.
Thank you so much, Professor or Herr Dr. Professor Sommer. I've learned that. I am going to talk to you about the part of the human condition that involves the imagination. And this is part 1. It's called Philosophical Bits and Pieces. Dr. Samuel Johnson, the 18th century English literary sage, called the imagination, quote, a licentious and vagrant category, unsusceptible of limitations and impatient of restraint, has always endeavored to baffle the logician, to perplex the confines of distinction, and burst the enclosures of regularity, end quote. According to Dr. Johnson, the imagination does not follow the rules. He gives it the qualities of a person, someone who wanders about aimlessly, explodes categories, and refuses to obey logic. The doctor's imagination is a rebellious character. Because I believe it will help our thinking to visualize someone named imagination, let us make this fictional character a student living in the world today, an adolescent who is also something of an insurrectionist, someone who does not want to be boxed in by feminine and masculine, by binary gender ideas, and goes by the pronoun they. Let us say imagination reads a lot, changes their mind, spends hours daydreaming, and imagines themselves in different situations. And they writes poems, lots of poems. During the pandemic, this person has been lonely and had more time to fantasize and to write. They also worries about climate change, rising waters, fires, melting glaciers, and the lack of biodiversity that may well make the viral leap from animal to human more likely. Imagination dreads more pandemics ahead. They is distressed about the weakening of democracies around the world and racism, xenophobia, and misogyny. Imagination imagines a different future for our earth and for the people on it. The details of where this person lives, what they look like, what foods, sports, and music they like, I will leave up to your imaginations. It is not surprising that this unruly type can't be easily defined or broken down. Some philosophers have cut imagination into different parts to make it easier to locate. Is the imagination simply the ability to see a picture of a mouse in your mind, even when you are not looking at a mouse? How is it different from remembering something? Is it the ability to conjure impossible events? I can easily imagine levitating off my chair right now and flying, even though I know it won't happen. Do some people have more imagination than others? Is genius a big imagination? Could we have empathy for other people without imagination? This roaming thing has been famously hard to capture. What is it? Can we find imagination somewhere in the human body? Is it in our heads, specifically in our brains? Is it linked to sensuality, feeling, and emotion? Can we think or perceive without it? Is it outside us in the culture with its many myths and stories? Do other animals have it? Are dreams spontaneous works of our imagination? Every night, most of us wander around foreign places, meet strange people, and sometimes encounter people we know who don't look at all like themselves. Some of us undergo metamorphoses, acquire new limbs or a third eye, and have sex with the most unlikely people. Imagination has a Latin root, imaginatio, images, seeing. German, French, and English share the word fantasie, fantasy, from the Greek fantasia, a word that also summons vision, appearance, visibility. Plato, a philosopher who casts a long shadow, not the least because he had a great influence on Christianity, was suspicious of mimesis, copies. He believed that our sensual body with its needs for food and love, the imaginary pictures those needs create in our minds, but also the paintings and poems made by artists, seduced people away from the truth. Behind our flawed and changing world is a static world of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms. The human soul could glimpse if it wasn't weighed down by its corporeal prison. Geometry, Plato argues in the Republic, can turn us away from perception and toward the eternal world of forms. The idea of a triangle is more perfect than any triangle a person can draw. The drawing is just a pale copy of the perfect idea. Plato divided the soul into parts. In the Timaeus, he places the lower appetited part of the soul that involves thirst, hunger, and sexual cravings in the human belly, and the higher rational soul in the brain. The higher soul works to control the lower one. In the Symposium, Plato makes it clear that the creative philosophical intellect that gives birth to ideas is superior to natural birth, a pregnant woman who pushes a living person out of her body. Plato's thoughts about the high pure mind and the low impure body remain with us, as does an uneasiness about the imagination and the suspicion that this character is nice up to a point, but they can get out of control and, like a howling mental patient, may have to be restrained and sedated. Aristotle's importance is at least as great as Plato's. And yet his ideas were lost to the West for a time because translations from the Greek were unavailable. Arab scholars, however, had excellent translations and commentaries on the philosopher's work, and through them, as well as Jewish scholars translating Aristotle from the Hebrew, his ideas were returned to the West in the Middle Ages and eventually incorporated into church teaching by Thomas Aquinas. It is good to remember that ideas get lost, that they travel, cross cultures, mutate over the ages, and sometimes are found again. For Aristotle, fantasia was a faculty of the soul. He located the soul in the heart, but he did not believe, as Plato did, that souls escape the body after death to enter new ones. He separated form, the animating masculine life force, from matter, which was passive and feminine. The two needed each other, but form was definitely superior to matter. He distinguished phantasmata, sensory impressions or images, from both our actual sensations, the smell of lilacs, the taste of honey, the sound of the birds, the feeling of your hand in cold water, the sight of a red flower, from reasoned thought. Phantasmata were what we retained in memory or imagination after our senses had been engaged. Aristotle believed we needed these mental pictures to think. But to be honest, he is vague on this mixed state of seeing images and thinking. He regarded internal pictures as an inferior form of knowing, the kind of knowing human beings share with other animals. The rational soul, on the other hand, belonged only to people. Phantasmata served as a mediator between lower bodily sensation and higher thought, a role it continued to play in Western philosophy. The imagination is a body-mind go-between. During the late 16th and throughout the 17th century, ideas about nature, including human beings, began to change, to break apart. This is the time we now call the scientific revolution and the early modern era. The shift in thought is summed up by Galileo Galilei, 1564-1642. I'm giving you the dates. Often called the father of modern science, who supposedly said, "Measure what can be measured and make measurable what cannot." Even if he didn't say it, the sentence suggests something important about the turn that took place with his discoveries. Philosophers began to believe that nature could only be properly understood mathematically. Galileo championed a universe with the sun at its center, something we now consider a fact. But as punishment for daring to say so, he was put under house arrest by the church for the rest of his life. This is a famous story. This is a famous story, one told again and again, with Galileo as the hero. Although the story is certainly true, it has also taken on mythical dimensions. There is never just one way to tell what we think of as the very same story. There are many ways, and even true stories from the past can become myths, accompanied by a famous quotation that the famous person may never have said. A myth is more than just a narrative. It is a story that tells us why things are the way they are. Myths are important because even though they have imaginary qualities, through them we can glimpse the thoughts of a whole group of people. There are religious, cultural, and scientific myths. René Descartes, 1596-1650, was considered the most important philosopher of his day. He was part of the big change that viewed nature as a machine that could be described in mathematical terms. He argued that, I'm quoting, arithmetic and geometry, whether they really exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable, end quote. For Descartes, the human body, like all other natural things, was part of the natural world. Its functions, he wrote, quote, including passion, memory, and imagination, follow from the mere arrangement of the machine's organs every bit as naturally as the movements of a clock or some other automaton follow from the arrangement of its counterweights and wheels, end quote. This way of thinking about nature is called mechanistic, and it continues in science to this day. For Descartes, this created a problem, however. If people are no different from automatons, how do we think and act? Everything is determined. Free will is impossible. Descartes found his solution by arguing that although our bodies are machines, our minds are not. The human mind, unlike the rest of us, takes up no space, so it cannot be made of matter. It isn't flesh, bone, skin, or brain, but spirit, esprit, or soul, âme, attached to the material body. The mind has innate ideas already present at birth. He famously cut the human mind off from the mechanical animal body. Animals were all machine, no spirit. And yet he had to bring the two parts together somehow. The body was responsible for perception, memory, and imagination. So it had to meet the mind somewhere, or the human being would fall apart. He located that spot in the brain's pineal gland that housed both common sense and fantasie, the imagination, which mediated between the body and the mind. Descartes' argument about the pineal gland is complicated and not at all as silly as it sounds. Like Plato, he distrusted the senses and was convinced they conspire to delude us. In his meditation on first philosophy, he wonders how he can be sure he isn't dreaming. His first biographer, Adrien Baillet, reported that when Descartes was a 23-year-old soldier, he had 3 powerful dreams on the same cold night in 1619. Dreams that had a powerful impact on him and led to his rigorous method for certainty. The notes Descartes made about the dreams are lost, but we know the dream state worried him. Seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching can happen in dreams, but these are sensory delusions. Knowledge is a rational, step-by-step process of the spirit, soul, mind, one he penetrated through his own subjective powers from his own methodical, clear and distinct, isolated, grown-up thoughts. I think, therefore I am. Isaac Newton, 1642-1727, read Descartes closely and carefully and criticized his ideas. Newton is, of course, credited with the mathematical system that unveiled the laws of physics. He explained the known world as natural, unchanging, and predictable. It is important to note that God was not kicked out of these systems. For Newton, God penetrated both space and time. He was everywhere. Descartes' dualistic system, one solution to the mind-body problem, a problem that has never gone away, was to link the human psyche, soul, mind to God. Imagination was left on earth with the mortal pineal gland. Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher and Descartes' contemporary, insisted that the immaterial mind did not exist. The mind, just like the body, was a machine. And he wrote letters to Descartes telling him how he had gone wrong. Both men were peevish and irritable with the other and sometimes talked right past each other. Still, a common problem in intellectual life. Hobbes insisted that everything in nature is made of matter and motion, and that imagination played an important role in human thinking. All thought originated in our senses, and the imagination was a kind of leftover or decayed sense. After the object is removed, Hobbes wrote, or the eye shut, we still retain an image of the thing seen, though more obscure than when we see it, end quote. Hobbes linked imagination, memory, and dreams, and he argued that memories can always be rearranged to make imaginative objects. We use memory to create something that doesn't exist. His example, the mythical centaur, a combination of horse and man. Like Descartes, he believed that our senses and the imagination they spawn can betray us. He also thought imaginative combinations were the source of many misleading superstitions, which led people to believe in ghosts and witches. Further, the imagination could drive you crazy. A great fancy, he wrote, is one kind of madness. But he also believed that careful mental reflection could set us straight. For Hobbes, human reason is tightly linked to language that organizes the human mind into trains of thought. And this is what makes human beings different from other animals. Hobbes and Descartes agreed that the body was an automaton with complex parts. Their disagreement was about the mind-soul. In the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712-1778, the thinker famous for his idea that man in his natural state is good and it is society that corrupts him, especially European bourgeois society, granted the imagination a big role in human development. He too bound it to sensory experience. Our first masters of philosophy, he wrote, are our feet, our hands, our eyes. He rejected the idea that reason could be separated from the senses or our passions, what we now call emotion. Unlike other thinkers, Rousseau did not believe the imagination was a natural inborn human trait that belonged to the body or to the mind. He believed it was acquired in our relations with other people, which placed it between nature and culture, and it could be used for good and for ill. Rousseau was deeply ambivalent about this faculty. Imagination could help you become a moral person close to God, or it could deprave you. Because there is no limit to what a person can imagine having or doing, he contended, the imagination can create unhappiness and resentment because a person's dreams can reach far beyond what is actually possible. The imagination is what makes men chase illusions. David Hume argued that human beings are made of experience alone, and all knowledge starts with perception. Although he distinguished between what he called impressions that include direct sensations and emotions, and ideas, the fainter, weaker, leftover impressions or phantasmata we use to remember, reason, and imagine, he did not think the two were qualitatively different. He gave imagination a vital role in perception itself as a unifier and organizer of the sporadic impressions that come our way. He was suspicious of fancies, however. Hume had no category of pure intellect. He recognized the limits of logic and reason and is famous as a skeptic who believed absolute certainty does not exist and that human beings have no direct access to physical objects in the world. In 1776, when Rousseau was running away from state and church authorities whom he had offended, David Hume graciously offered Rousseau refuge in England. Rousseau accepted. It soon turned out that the two men could not stand each other. Whole books have been written about their famous public feud. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, read Rousseau and was by all accounts shaken up by Hume. Although he agreed with Hume that we could not know the real world, the thing in itself, das Ding an sich, he believed he could analyze the features of the human mind. Some of those features were innate and directed our perception. He gave the imagination an immensely important role in human life, and he too used it as a bridge, a synthesizer or transformer that acted between the senses and the understanding. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant refers to the free play of the imagination, uniting with the laws of understanding. Notice that the imagination plays freely but mingles with reason, the lawgiver. For Kant, there was a reproductive imagination, one that repeats what was or is, and a productive imagination that is active and creative. Kant paved the way for the idealists and romantics of the 19th century who celebrated the imagination, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, as well as poets such as Blake, Baudelaire, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. For these thinkers and writers, the imagination was key not only to understanding the self, but the source of human creativity. In The Queen of Faculties, Baudelaire wrote, "Imagination created the world." It was in this period that the notion of the creative genius became popular. The idea of the special man who by some fluke of his brain or sublime inspiration makes works of art that change the world. We are still influenced by this idea. Picasso is generally regarded as such a person. He has become an artistic myth. And yet, by the 20th century, many philosophers and scientists wanted nothing to do with the imagination. The important exceptions to this rule are thinkers in the philosophical movement we call phenomenology, a study of subjective experience. Edmund Husserl, Edith Stein, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, as well as the American pragmatist philosophers John Dewey, William James, and Charles Sanders Peirce, and another American who doesn't fit well in any school, Suzanne Langer. I will touch on some of their ideas later. Although Jean-Paul Sartre's first book was about the imagination, he then abandoned it as a subject. Pictures in the mind, dreams, fantasies, and hallucinations made some philosophers nervous, as irrational, emotional, and not fit for study. The American behaviorist psychologist John B. Watson went so far as to argue that mental imagery, phantasmata, was little more than an ancient superstition. In his book, The Concept of Mind, 1949, the English philosopher Gilbert Ryle wrote, "There is no special faculty of the imagination occupying itself single-mindedly in fancied viewings and hearings," end quote. Many in the Anglo-American analytical school of philosophy forced our character imagination into exile. This figure has been crawling back, but many are still not sure what to do with the rebel. My purpose is not to give you a history of the imagination in philosophy. What I have outlined briefly are pieces of Western thought, a select few of the usual suspects, famous philosophers who are never left out of the story of the West. I want to show you that even though ideas change in history, they can also last a long time. They become part of us without our being aware of it. They become working myths. I am not using myth in a derogatory way. I think myths must be examined, but they are not necessarily bad for us, just as the imagination is not bad or good. To make the idea concrete, our character imagination has bad days and good ones, makes mistakes, has regrets, and is sometimes kind and sometimes not. Many abstract ideas remain fuzzy and hard to define. It is clear that great numbers of people think of the mind as an invisible floating spirit or soul that is different from the body, even though they may not believe in God. At the same time, few people can make an argument for how exactly that might work. We still think of mathematics, chemistry, and physics as the pinnacles of thought, the truly serious disciplines that involve measurement. History, literature, and philosophies that are not rooted in science are somehow less serious, more imaginary, softer than the hard stuff that has numbers attached to it. We live in a world that loves data. Numbers rule. The body belongs to biology, a discipline that explores living cells and systems. But unlike physics, it has no laws, just regularities, and it's still viewed as messier and lower than mathematics. Descartes' belief in the step-by-step, logical unveiling of the truth through pure intellect, untouched by sensation and emotion, remains with us. There is a reason why the physicist Stephen Hawking, who suffered from ALS, a terrible neurodegenerative disorder that nevertheless preserves the functioning brain, was embraced by popular culture with an enthusiasm rarely given to other scientists, with the notable exception of Einstein. Hawking was a man. He was brilliant. He was courageous. He also literally embodied a cultural fantasy by virtue of his illness. His disability suggested that he was, if not all mind, mostly a soaring mind in need of very little body, and he was as much machine as flesh. We all fall sway to myths. In harmony with Aristotle's views of masculine and feminine principles, study after study shows that men and women alike connect men to mind, culture, and action, and women to the body, nature, and passivity. And just as Aristotle did, they regard the masculine as superior to the feminine. Despite the many philosophical differences about what imagination actually is, there are questions which return. Is imagining an object different from perceiving a thing in the world? Remembering, imagining, and dreaming are often lumped together as related faculties, but how are they connected? Plato and Descartes believed we could think without the imagination. Aristotle, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Kant did not. How dangerous is it? Are psychiatric patients victims of their runaway imaginations? Is the imagination a halfway house between irrational feeling and rational thinking? What about people who believe in conspiracy theories? What about fiction writers who spin out their own crazy plots? Can the imagination be reduced to bodily mechanisms, as Descartes and Hobbes believed? Say, some part of the brain between the limbic system that is linked to emotion and the prefrontal cortex that is linked to reasoning or executive function. How much do these current divisions of the brain, often referred to as higher and lower regions, rely on our philosophical past? Let us return to our character, the one we are inventing together, imagination. They is at the beginning, not the end of their life, trying to make sense of the world. The library is full of books, fiction and nonfiction. The internet is alive with thoughts and images. Is the information true or false? Is the person online lying, or is she a victim of her imagination? Our character is attracted by ideas that promote kindness and inclusion. After all, imagination's choice to avoid being identified by gender hasn't made life all that easy. The culture at large is often uncomfortable with such a decision, and our character has suffered for it, been made fun of, criticized, and hurt. Why should the ideas of ancient and modern philosophers on the imagination matter to this young person? Keep this in mind. We are all creatures of our culture's history of ideas, whether we like it or not. Every single one of us is born into a world that is ready-made. No one chooses to be born. No one chooses his, her, or their parents to be born rich, poor, black, brown, or white, male, female, or intersex, into a loving family or one that is torn apart. And no one chooses the idea whether one starts out with either. The beliefs and myths we learn as children. And yet, after a certain age, most children ask questions. Around 3, my daughter Sophie continually asked me, why? Why, Mom? I always tried to answer her. Once that year, she was sitting in the bathtub, looked up at me, and said, Mom, when I grow up, will I still be Sophie? Could this philosophical question be posed without imagination? Didn't the child have to know that little people become big people and that she was no exception? Didn't she have to run ahead in time and imagine herself in the future with an adult body and then wonder what on earth that would be like? Around the same time, she asked her father if she would get a penis when she grew up. Most 3-year-old children have learned to identify themselves as boys or girls, but they do not realize that without intervention, their genitals do not change. After all, breasts and beards arrive later in life. Why not other parts? Aren't children always imagining and playing they are adults? Isn't play part of childhood itself? Is play natural? Aristotle regarded children as unformed adults. Like women and slaves, they resided lower on his hierarchy of being. Male children could at least grow into maturity. The others continued lives of inferiority. Descartes referred to the ways his sensory perceptions tricked him as a child and how he grew out of those delusions. But he never developed a philosophy of childhood. Rousseau did. He presented his thought in the form of a novel, Émile, or On Education, 1762, in which a character called Jean-Jacques brings up another character, the orphan boy Émile. In his Confessions, Rousseau admits to fathering 5 children. He abandoned all of them to a foundling hospital, but explains that convincing his lover, Thérèse Levasseur, wasn't easy. Quote, I had the greatest difficulty in the world persuading her to accept the sole means of saving her honor, end quote. Émile is a work of fiction about the education of an imaginary boy written by a man who had rid himself of one real child after another. Is the book an imaginary substitute for the lost experience of bringing up a son? What role does guilt play in the project? It is fascinating to me that the teacher, Jean-Jacques, the author's alter ego, works hard to keep the boy from developing an imagination before the age of 12. no books allowed. He is supposed to learn exclusively from his sensory perceptions and physical needs. He can play outside, but not with other children. Apparently, this solitary play does not engage his imagination. The reader is told the boy has little feeling for others. Rousseau believed that although man in his natural state has pity for his fellows, he has no compassion. Compassion arrives through the imagination. It is triggered by social interactions, but these involvements must be handled carefully. When Emile is 12, Jean-Jacques gives him a novel, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. The fiction lays the ground for developing Emile's imagination. Notably, this famous story is about a shipwrecked man alone on an island building a world for himself until a native man he calls Friday comes along rather late in the novel, and the two begin to work together. Rousseau gave Emile a love object whom he called Sophie. Unlike my own child, this fictional Sophie cannot philosophize and is not given the same education as the boy because her mind and body are weak. And the education Rousseau designs for her is one to please her man. She too is given a novel, François Fenelon's didactic The Adventures of Telemachus, 1699, a retelling of the son's search for his father in Homer's Odyssey, although in this version, Telemachus has many more travels. The book is not meant to inspire Sophie to take off on adventures of her own, but rather to encourage her to fall in love with the fictional character Telemachus, who prepares her to love a real person, Emile, who of course is really also a character in a novel. Although I often hear people say, oh, well, everyone thought women were inferior back then. There were women and men of the period who agitated for serious education for girls. The English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who greatly admired Rousseau, was nevertheless appalled by the character of Sophie. 30 years after Emile was published, she wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, in which she argues that a girl should not be educated as, quote, a fanciful kind of half-being, end quote, but as a whole person. Although Wollstonecraft was influenced by Rousseau, her view of the imagination differed from his. Rousseau believed reason developed out of our senses, passions, and imagination. It was a kind of late blooming flower on the plant, but the flower had no control over the roots or stem. Wollstonecraft disagreed. Reason could direct the imagination. Interestingly, she thought animals might have reason, but not a shred of imagination. For her, imagination in combination with reason distinguished human beings from beasts. While Rousseau thought that chasing dreams made people miserable, Wollstonecraft believed it wasn't always a bad thing. Even the futile quest can educate the traveler. Almost a century before Rousseau wrote Emile, the Cartesian philosopher François Poulain de la Barre published On the Equality of the Two Sexes. This is 1673. The mind, he wrote, has no sex. If we follow Descartes as Poulain did, it seems we would have to argue that even if the mind has no sex, the imagination does because it is tied to the body. Descartes never took up the question, but I have often been asked a similar question about my own work, especially my novels. A couple of them have male narrators, and one has many narrators, both women and men. Do women write differently from men? The answer depends on how you categorize the imagination. Does the imagination have a sex? Poulain remains obscure. Rousseau and Wollstonecraft are famous. There are many philosophers who never made it into standard histories of Western philosophy, whose ideas were lost or nearly lost. Sometimes their works burned in fires. Sometimes only fragments remain. Sexism and racism are sometimes to blame for disappearing thinkers. Other times, whole schools of philosophy become unpopular, then forgotten. I often wonder how many brilliant thinkers have simply vanished. It is worth noting that of the philosophers and writers I have mentioned, Rousseau was not the only one who scandalized the church. The works of Galileo, Descartes, Hobbes, Defoes, Wollstonecraft, Kant, and Sartre were all on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a running list of books banned by the Catholic Church, which lasted from 1632 to 1966, a long time. Of course, if you made that list, it meant you had to have created some noise in the world. You couldn't be too obscure. Two philosophers whom I have written about and who did not appear on the index, both of whom have remained marginal but not unknown in the history of ideas, refuse to accept the idea of the rational mind as high and pure and the body as low, deceptive, and dirty. Like Rousseau, Kant, and Wollstonecraft, who wrote after them, they acknowledged the imagination as a productive, creative force. Neither of them understood body, mind, or imagination as mechanical entities that could ultimately be described mathematically. For them, imagination and reason belonged to the body, and there was no hierarchy, no top and bottom, no better and worse. They are the English poet, essayist, playwright, proto-novelist, and natural philosopher, Margaret Cavendish, 1623-1673, and the Italian philosopher and historian, Giambattista Vico, 1668-1744. Margaret Cavendish was highborn. She was a lady-in-waiting to the English queen, Henrietta Maria, met her husband, a duke, in court, and became the Duchess of Newcastle. She was self-taught with help from her brother, who studied at university. Women were not formally educated then, and they were not supposed to publish their work, which Cavendish did. There were women philosophers of the time who engaged in the subject by writing letters, which was viewed as more acceptable. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia had a fascinating correspondence with Descartes between 1643 and 1650, the year he died. Some people called the Duchess Mad Madge. She was a scandalous character who broke the rules. She sometimes dressed half in men's clothing and half in women's. She once appeared at the theater in a gown so low it displayed her rouged nipples. She made herself a spectacle at a spectacle. She read Descartes, Hobbes, and many other thinkers of the period closely, knew a lot about science, including optics and microscopy, and corresponded with important figures of the day who took her ideas seriously. She met Descartes, but they had no conversation. And when she reached out to Hobbes, he snubbed her. Unlike many natural philosophers of the period, she valued imagination as much as reason and championed it as a rich, subjective avenue to understanding the world. In the same volume, she published a work of natural philosophy, Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, and a work of speculative fiction, The Blazing World. The two parts, she wrote, were, quote, joined as two worlds at the end of their poles. The ideas in the philosophical work mingle with those in the fanciful work. They are of a piece. Like a meal, the blazing world is a philosophical fiction. Cavendish faithfully believed works of the imagination could be sources of knowledge. In her note to the reader before the blazing world, she distinguishes between fancy and reason, but insists that although one results in truth and the other in fiction, both are, quote, the actions of the rational parts of matter. As Hobbes had before her, she argued against Descartes' idea that the mind belonged only to human beings and that it was immaterial, something separate from the body. But unlike Hobbes, she maintained that nature was not a machine. It was active, self-moving, possessed of its own quivering energy from the tiniest worm to human beings. And these processes never stopped. Even death and decay were part of the larger motions of nature. She insisted that other animals, plants, and even minerals participated in forms of knowing. Everything was composed of a mixture of animate and inanimate matter, but in varying degrees. Moreover, she stressed that no part of nature could be separated from other parts, that every piece was related to and dependent on others, and human beings had no right to feel superior to the rest of nature simply because they walked around and could talk. Cavendish elevated and dignified matter and every natural body. Although as a female philosopher, she suffered from condescension and cruelty, she held out hope that sometime in the future, her ideas would take hold. Today, we would call her a philosopher ecologist, a person who understands the delicate balance of ecosystems and their fragile interdependence. Much of what Cavendish argued in the 17th century can be seen in arguments today in the philosophy of biology. I've written a paper on this that will be published later this year. Some thinkers have turned away from machine models in biology, which they say do not accurately represent natural processes. Organisms, they argue, are not machines, and it is a mistake to look at them that way. Over the course of about 50 years, Margaret Cavendish's reputation has been slowly rising. After centuries of neglect or ridicule, both literary scholars and philosophers have discovered an original voice from the past that has something important to say to us today. Vico, like Cavendish, strongly opposed Cartesian ideas. His masterwork, The New Science, the third edition of which was published in 1744, the year of his death, argued against Descartes' elevation of mathematics over other studies. He believed the imagination was fundamental, the source of human history and all of history's creations. He distinguished among memoria, fantasia, and ingenio, memory, imagination, and ingenuity. Memory brings back what was, imagination rearranges memories, and ingenuity is able to rearrange them in such a way that something new is created. For Vico, all meaning is rooted in our bodies, in its sensations, emotions, and social relations with other people. Truth is not static, as it is for Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and many others, but is historically contingent. We create meanings that develop over time, both historical time and in the lifetime of a single person, from babyhood to adulthood, and they necessarily involve other people. Like Crusoe, Vico was interested in children and knew they thought in ways that are different from adults. He noticed that they were prone to animism, that children attribute living qualities to dead objects. He also observed that they were great imitators. Looking closely at children, he thought, would help him understand archaic human beings. Vico tells a story about the people who roamed the earth after Noah and the great biblical flood, the beastly giants. The giganti did not have concepts, ideas, or even a social life, but they had big bodies and big feelings. One day, the giants heard great cracks of thunder for the first time. Looking up toward the sound, they saw the dark, churning, threatening sky. Terrified, they began to tremble and uttered an involuntary sound, pa. It had no meaning, but it became a sign or symbol for the noise and its source. The utterance called into being an angry god, Jove. The Giganti, Vico argued, were poetic, not rational beings. They projected their own volatile feelings onto the environment in a metaphorical movement. The sky was the god's body, the rumbling thunder of fury. Vico called this metamorphosis from body to world poetic logic. Quote, the principle of poetic sentences formed by feelings of passion and emotion, end quote. Poetic logic arose from the interaction between feeling bodies and the places in which they were situated. For Vico, this is the beginning of language, communication, and social existence. Jove, Vico wrote, was born naturally in poetry as a divine character or imaginative universal, end quote. All meaning begins in what he calls the mute body before speech. But with the first word, myths and stories begin to grow, and they invest the world with collective social meaning. And although greater abstraction, reflection, and categorical thinking advanced as time went on, Vico maintained that the poetic logic, so prevalent in children, lives on inside all of us. And that when we are at a loss for words or are trying to explain something ambiguous, this metaphorical way of understanding wins the day. Like Crusoe after him, Vico lifted imagination out of solitary human existence and made it social. No one knows if Rousseau read Vico or not, but there are strong affinities between them. For Vico, nature belonged to God, history belonged to mankind. His new science analyzed what human beings produced over time: languages, religions, social practices, institutions, sciences, and artifacts, all of which shape human understanding. By looking carefully at our creations, we can better understand ourselves, how we have changed and how we have stayed the same, what cultures have in common and how they are different. Vico was bitterly disappointed by the reception or non-reception of his great project, the new science. He had a large family to support and was paid poorly at his university job. He suffered. Vico has remained on the margins of mainstream intellectual culture for a long time. He was read by Karl Marx, Wilhelm Dilthey, and James Joyce, all of whom gave him some reflected glory. Dilthey, 1833-1911, used Vico's ideas to distinguish between Naturwissenschaft, the natural sciences, and Geisteswissenschaft, the study of the human mind. What we now call the humanities He saw that the natural sciences, this is back in the 19th century, he saw that the natural sciences were valued more highly than the humanities and wanted to make an argument for the merits of Geisteswissenschaft. What we now call the humanities and the social sciences were important, Dilthey maintained, because they study what human beings make, objective mind, objektiver Geist, which includes both human practices and things. Interest in Vico's work, like Cavendish's, has been rising recently, chiefly because in both the sciences and the humanities, there has been a turn toward the body when trying to puzzle out the mystery of the mind, now often referred to as consciousness. The problems of the 17th and 18th centuries have not disappeared. No one has solved the mind-body problem. People have been fighting about the body, the mind, and the imagination since the ancient Greeks. They were fought over again in the 17th century, and we are still fighting about them today. These days, there are many scholars and scientists who regard the mind as an embodied faculty situated in a particular place and time. As with most ideas, this change happens slowly. In the 20th century, cognitive science, the study of how the mind works, owed much to Descartes. The mind was a rational system of abstract symbols. The computer metaphor that dominated the discipline viewed the mind as software that could be attached to different hardware, a living human body or the silicon body of a machine. The senses, imagination, and emotion were ignored because they had nothing to do with thinking and reasoning. It is easy to see how artificial intelligence, AI, is rooted in 17th century ideas about our bodies as automatons and the mind as somehow separate, Descartes, or the mind as more whirring wheels and pulleys, Hobbes. But in AI, problems with this idea became more apparent. In 1980, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson published a book, Metaphors We Live By, in which they, like Vico, argued that metaphors are not literary ornament, but rooted in our bodily and cultural situation and shape our thoughts and actions. Mind and reason are not cut off from the body. They argued that the very conceptual structure of thought is metaphorical. They never mentioned Vico. I do not think the authors had any knowledge of his work. They were rooted in a particular Anglo-American tradition and write as if their ideas are revolutionary and without precedent. They, along with others, inaugurated a shift in cognitive science, now called second-generation cognitive science. Although there are many ideas about what embodiment actually means, it has become a word for our time. Arguments about mechanism and reductionism continue. There is now something called the new mechanical philosophy to distinguish it from the old kind. Reductionism is also being challenged. The reductionist asserts that if you understand every little working piece of an organism or a machine, you will understand it completely. You can break it down, put it back together again, and predict how it will function. But not everyone believes this is possible. What if the whole is more than its parts? What if organisms are different from machines and mind emerges from smaller parts or affects those parts once it has emerged? What if organisms are not always predictable? These are questions people in philosophy and the sciences are asking now. Cavendish and Vico fit nicely into our intellectual moment. I like to think of them as the grandmother and grandfather to ideas about embodiment and the importance of emotion, feeling, and the imagination. It is fair to tell you that bringing these two thinkers together and thinking of them as grandparents is not just unusual. I am the only one I know of who has ever suggested such a thing. One could argue that my linking these two is an act of my imagination, one that rearranges historical memory in light of the present moment, which is fair to characterize as a time of crisis on multiple fronts. Let us say that our character, imagination, has been listening to this talk. Has it brought any clarity to their mind, except that mind, body, and imagination are all muddled concepts? And yet, perhaps, like my Sophie, but in a far more sophisticated way, imagination has formed some questions. Is the imagination born with us because it is part of our species? Or is it acquired later through our interactions with other people? Could any person dream, imagine, or think without other people dreaming, imagining, or thinking? What do words have to do with it? How do big cultural myths affect a person's private imaginings? Was Dr. Johnson right about the imagination? Maybe it winks at logic and resists category. Maybe it's not mechanical, but wild and playful. Thank you. I have to tell you that my doorbell has been ringing off the hook and I have a telephone going at the same time. So I may have to open the door. Professor Sommer? Hi, guys. No? Not it. Can I go and answer the door just for a second and come back? Can you hear me? Okay. Oh yes. Now I can hear you. Can I run down and answer the door and just run right back up? It's been ringing like 20 times. I'll be right back.
This is what life is like in New York, Brooklyn. I can tell you, last night the internet broke down, and I heard that Siri Hustvedt has had a very stressful night, and she worked hard to make the internet going again, which luckily it did. You now have the opportunity to ask questions. Peter Lutzka is going to translate the questions into English if you want to ask in German. Who would like to start with the first question? Will you come to the front and take the microphone? Is there a second question coming? So, to come over here. And so, Peter, you can stay there. I will vacate the stage so that we leave time for our people who want to ask questions. Are you going to ask in English? No, German, obviously. Now, please be so kind as to stand here, wait for Siri to come back, and smile.
1,000 apologies, but I have to tell you, this delivery person was not going to stop ringing. So if I'd let it go, we just would have had doorbells and telephone calls. So it's now accomplished. Hello.
Okay, so I have a short question. I wonder, would you say that someone's soul mind can develop without imagination, without fantasy? And if that is possible, what kind of development would that be?
Well, that's a deep philosophical question that I admire. And I think it's exactly the kind of question that has been asked over time. What happens if a person has no imagination, right? What would that be like? You know, that they know now, for example, that there are people who have no phantasmata, as I was saying, they have no mental imagery. And most people do, but these people are not deeply handicapped. They can remember things. They're just not seeing the pictures. So that would be one answer to your question, which is that kind of imagination, not everyone has. Some people have more vivid dreams than other people. Some people have, so there's a whole spectrum of human experience. You might also want to ask the question about certain conditions or states, autism, for example, which I don't think is a condition without imagination, but it's a different kind of imagining. What I do think is an error is to give absolute priority to the kind of linear reasoning that is, well, very much necessarily part of, say, mathematics, physics, and what we think of as the hard sciences, which I think is good. But what I'm trying to talk about is a broader idea that eliminates those hierarchies. Can anyone live without the imagination? It's an excellent question. I'm not sure we know. I think we would have to look into states of being in psychiatry and neurology. For example, there are people who have brain damage who not only lose the ability to remember, if they have damage to a little part of the brain called the hippocampus, they also cannot imagine very well. So remembering and imagination seem to go together and be related to that particular part of the brain. And I think many of those patients feel the loss of those abilities, that it's painful. Is that like a little step towards answering your question? A little bit, you understand? Yeah.
Hello. My question
Hello.
is what you said to your daughter if she will stay Sophie when she grows. Yes. And if you would say that you are still the same person as a child.
All right. I mean, one of the reasons I quoted that line is because it is truly one of the great philosophical questions of all time. What is it about us that we can think of as continuous? If someone shows you your baby picture, if you didn't know that was you, you might not be able to recognize yourself at all, right? So the changes that take place, not to speak of from, the very beginning of life to the end of life, what does the 2-year-old or 3-year-old have to do with the 96-year-old woman who's on her deathbed? These are excellent questions. The cellular makeup is not the same, right? Our cells turn over. There isn't a damn thing left at 96 that you had in the beginning, except, of course, that there is a DNA sequence that remains the same. Now, memory is a way of creating continuities. So I have a few fragmentary memories that most people have from like 3 might be my earliest. And after about 6, I begin to have a continuous memory because I was going to school, so there are places I remember. There's a kind of routine that takes over. And I think narrative abilities, right? We tie ourselves together by telling a story about ourselves and to other people that are socially consolidated. So do I remember, what is a myth and what is real? My mother used to call me Princess on the Pea. Do you know that fairy tale about all the all the mattresses, and they put a little pea underneath there, and the princess could feel the pea. So that was the thing about my sensitivity, that I was extremely sensitive, and that probably shaped my personality to some degree. And also, I still feel like I'm quite a sensitive person, even some of my neurological sensitivities that are related to migraine. So there's a continuity, but it's also shaped by some kind of story and mythos that seems to be important to it. All these are such deep philosophical questions that you could talk about them for 100 years, but it's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Are we waiting for another bold soul? There's a bold soul.
My question is about books and reading in general, because I grew up without television and smartphone, and my mom always said I had to read the Harry Potter books before I could watch the movies. And in recent years, I had the impression that especially younger people read less. And my question is, do you think, and through reading in my childhood, I think that I developed a lot of imagination and creativity and fantasy by reading. And do you think that in the future, what are the consequences that people read less because of the digital alternatives? And
Well, this is also, I think this is quite an important question, and that it has to be answered in a way that's not hysterical. I think everyone reads the press and it's like the future is going to be, children with oatmeal brains, connected to their machines. We have to remember that mass literacy in the West, it's not that old, right? We're talking about the significant rise in the 18th century, the 19th century. In the 19th century, books were really the vehicles of so much. Now there is TV, there is, of course, the internet. There are many other forms that were not in existence. I do think you're right. I mean, I think you were lucky that your parents insisted that you read, because what is it that reading does that some of these other forms don't do? I think it is that you have to generate imaginative material to go with the text, right? I mean, it is amazing that we can read these abstract symbols and then have these remarkable experiences. So reading is a more active experience than watching a movie. I love movies, so it's not to disparage the form, but rather there's something specific about creating imaginative, visual or sensual or, you know, intellectual thoughts that are generated from what you're reading. Here's another thing. What happens when you read? When you read, you give up your own internal narrator, that little voice in your head that keeps, you know, spinning out, you know, sentences or fragments of sentences, and you give yourself up to the other voice. That takes over. Nobody can read and have their internal narrator going at the same time. Maybe you've noticed that there are moments when you like get distracted from your reading and you seem to be taking in the letters, but you're not understanding what you're reading, so you have to go back. That's a very interesting example of a split. But this is, I think, a vital aspect of the creativity that is part of reading, this giving up to the other. What happens then? If the book meant something to you emotionally, we remember emotion consolidates memory, then you take that with you. I think about reading as a way of gaining access to multitudes of voices that inhabit you, the ones you care about. They're there. They are not there exactly as they were written. You know, they get changed inside your own mind. It also creates, and only reading does this for me, a flexibility of mind that I know I couldn't have had if I hadn't read so many books by so many different kinds of writers with many different voices from many different places that did not agree with one another, right? So if you're only reading romance novels, you will get very good at that genre. Or if you're only playing video games of a certain time, you can get really quick and good. You'll be like some scientists who specialize in a particular field or one part of the brain, say, and they know that better than anyone else in the world. This is not going to create flexibility, and it is certainly not going to get us out of our societal, political, and scientific problems. For that, you need people who can think around and think from multiple perspectives. So I am a big pusher of reading. So keep it up. That's my thought. Oh, there he is. Thank you. Thank you. There's somebody.
I have a question.
I'm having a little trouble hearing. If you go close.
My experience is that when, for instance, I read something to a child and I do it with compassion, it has an effect on how the child can dive into that story. And my question is, if you have imagination as a reader of a story or a storyteller, will that imagination go be absorbed by the person. I mean, I remember when me and my brother were small, I always had a feeling we live in a common world of our common imagination. What would you say?
One share fantasy. And what she's saying, she's giving the example of reading to a child. She has the feeling when she reads to a child, the fantasies she has are carried into the child. The child is shaped by those fantasies themselves. And her question is, in that sense, is her own fantasy something that is then transported, is conveyed, becomes a part of the fantasy life of the other?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, and I think that I hope I will touch on exactly or on the shared and social nature of what we think of as the imagination, which is part of children's play, right? You know, that is often when kids are running around, they are sharing an agreed upon fantasy. Let's say, right, this is this, let's say that is that. And I think what's important, say you as an older person reading to a child are not necessarily explaining everything to the child, but there's something in child psychology they call scaffolding, which is the way a child increases her cognitive, imaginative, emotional abilities is through the grown-up other, who is in a way holding or sheltering the child's imagination. And then I think your question also is fascinating, which is to what degree are the images, let's say, that we produce in our own personal brains, related to the larger cultural fantasies that are out there to be taken, right? So if I'm reading a fairy tale and it says, once upon a time, there was an old woman who lived in the wood. What do you see? Well, we might not see the same thing, but usually I think what you're doing is you're creating an image that is going to keep the story going. So you might just see a very simple little cottage. I have a tendency to see sort of, pine trees, right? I get pine trees, I get the little house. And another person, perhaps from another culture, might have a very different imagery. But I do think these ideas are communicated. I do think that they're social. I do think that a huge part of our imaginative world exists between one person and another, right? It's not located in some isolated movie screen we have inside our heads. It is produced in the back and forth of living in a culture with others. And that child is definitely picking up on your imaginative reality.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question because I dream a lot and every night and like really a lot, and I often mix up my dreams with reality, so I can't. So I dream something, and the next morning, I don't know if that has really happened to me or if it was just a dream or imagination. I even I fell in love with a boy in a dream. And the day after, I had the feeling like I was in love with that boy. And it was crazy because I had never feelings for him, but then I had, and it held on for a week or 2 weeks, and that was mad. And why do dreams have such an impact on my life or just lives? And what
you know, this is, I mean, I wish I should have had a fourth lecture on dreaming. You know, I wasn't really able to get there, but I wanted to bring up the subject and keep bringing it up because nobody knows why we sleep and nobody knows why we dream. There are multiple theories, you know, in science and philosophy. What is this all about? We really do not know. Or we don't know much about dreaming in infancy or animal dreaming. But your dreams, so you probably find yourself on a spectrum of people who not only are affected, you know, by their dreams, but remember them. You know, lots of people don't remember their dreams. So you're waking up with the material. My daughter, Sophie, the one I mentioned in the lecture, is also like that. She has tremendous recall of her dreams. One thing I think is for sure, and in this sense, you know, Sigmund Freud, who wrote probably, I mean, certainly one of the most beautiful books about dreams that I strongly recommend. You don't have to buy every part of Freud's theory of dreams, but it's certainly worth reading. The Interpretation of Dreams is he argues the most important part, which is that the things that happen in dreams, the boy that you fell in love with in the dream, this did not really take place in your waking life. At the same time, the emotional force of that dream is real. You're really having those emotions. There's no artificial emotion, right? Just the way if you watch a movie and it's, you know, it overcomes you and you begin to weep. It's not that you're having a pretend moment of feeling sad. You're really sad. You're participating in what's happening. So that for you to be shaped by your dreaming life is not something to be worried about. I think it is part of the richness of one's emotional experience. Now, I too sometimes cannot remember if I dreamt something. I go, you know, a memory will come and I'll think, was that real? So that too is a common experience. But you as a vivid dreamer rememberer are probably just statistically going to have more of those experiences than others. I think from my philosophical point of view, what is important is not to discredit the emotions in our dreams. I think all emotions are meaningful, and you know, doesn't mean you have to you have to go out and find that particular person, but it's probably telling you something about your waking emotions, and those are really important.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was a wonderful closing remark. Siri, thank you so much for that wonderful lecture and answering that questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you guys, I wish I was closer to you. You look a little small, but I'm really grateful that you're that you're there. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to me. I really appreciate it. Take care, you guys. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow. We are looking
See you
forward to-
tomorrow. See you tomorrow.